What is that one movie?
Only one movie. Um, ooh, I would say an oldie. Usual Suspects.
Oh, that's a great okay.
Mhm.
That is a great choice. I'm writing that down. This is how I'm deciding what movies I watch, just by asking my guest each and every time. And thank you for making it easy for me. And listen, hey, success. It is streaming on YouTube. Uh,
Awesome.
all the haters and doubters be damned. We are here. We are live. And thank you for your patience, guys. Just a few minutes after 12. I'm here with Chris Ogonek from Nikon, one of their lead educators. We were speaking for a little while, and he said, hey, what kind of workshop can we do? Something that people can actually take advantage of and start practicing. And it was macro and product photography. And he prepared an amazing class for us. So we're going to talk about that. If you have any questions, just drop them in the chat. I will facilitate them and ask Chris these questions. But enough of me. Chris, how are you, and how are you holding up?
I'm pretty good. I'm holed up here in my office, working from home, safely self isolating. But other than the fact that the only time I pretty much leave the house is to walk my dog, I'm doing pretty well.
Nice, amazing to hear. And listen, I gotta say this as a Nikon user from beforehand. I'm looking at your bodies, the lenses you got. What a beautiful setup right there, right? Look at all
Yes,
those
yes. This
gold
is my.
badges.
I just happened to have a whole slew of lenses that I had borrowed right around the time when we went into shutdown. So I just have a whole slew of lenses ready
There
and
you
waiting
go.
to be shot.
There you go. Let's call it an extended loan. So we're going to be talking
Yes.
about macro and product photography, things people can actually take advantage of and start with at home. Let's get started with that. So I guess you want to start with the gear, the setup, the software, how people can get up and running pretty quickly. Let's start with that.
Well, there's a number of things that you can do with macro and product photography. So let's kind of talk product last, just because it is generally a little bit more involved. On the macro side, you can go really simple. You can go just get extension tubes if you really want to, just to get you an increased magnification. But ideally, to get the best image quality, the best usability, you use an actual macro lens. That's kind of the starting point. Is grab a macro lens and just start shooting. Now, what actually makes a macro lens a macro lens? Well, different people kind of classify it as different things, but we classify it as a true macro lens is a lens that has one-to-one magnification. So
Okay.
one-to-one magnification. If you can see there with the image of the quarter on the sensor. So that quarter in real life takes up that much of a sensor. So by it being a one-to-one magnification, the image that you get from that is essentially that exact same size. So a true macro lens essentially allows you to get very close to your subject matter. That's the kind of entry point for true macro photography. But the thing that kind of gets a lot of people hung up sometimes is like if you just look at our lineup. Other brands have the same relative offerings. So we have four different macro lenses. We have two for the crop sensor, two for DX, and two for our full frame. So we have a 40 mil, an 60 mil, an 85 mil, and a 105. Obviously differing the focal lengths there. So a lot of people look at them and go, well, okay, so if they're all macro lenses, why would I pick one over the other? And the easiest way to describe it is pretty much the working distance. So there's a
Okay.
few other little differences between them, but the working distance being how close from your camera to your subject is the biggest difference, with the 40 mil being the closest, the 60 being next, the 85 being next, and then the 105 being the furthest away. We do
Gotcha.
have a 200 as well, which is even further. But that's kind of the biggest difference between them. And for somebody to decide, well, which of those should I care about? Why does that make a difference? How close I am to the subject? It kind of depends on what you're shooting. So if you're shooting stamps, if you're reproducing your stamp collection, then if you're this far away from your subject, it doesn't really make a difference. But
Right.
if you're shooting creepy crawly insects, spiders, bees, ants, you really want to be as far away as possible as you possibly can be. So that's when the further working distance really comes into its own.
Gotcha. And one thing I should ask is, some people they might not have the means to get a macro lens right away. There's extension tubes that people can buy and adapters.
Yes.
What's the key difference there? I know we didn't plan to talk about this, but I thought I'd ask. Their extension tubes might be an option. It could get you close. What's the key difference between buying an extension tube and investing in a proper macro lens?
I've played with extension tubes too much, but I will say off the top of my head, I'm pretty sure the biggest difference is you lose, well, for one thing, there's a lot of different extension tubes. Some have very little compatibility. Some have a wide range of compatibility in terms of autofocus and metering. So it really depends on the brand and the tube that you buy. You have to be a little bit careful that if you do buy one that has a, I'll say a slimmer compatibility with, let's say, some of our lenses, then you may not have autofocus, you may not have auto exposure, so you may have to do everything manually, which isn't too big of a deal if you're just getting into it. And if we are at home and we're self-isolating and you have the extra time to kind of really go through things fully manually, you can do it. But I think that's the biggest drawback, is that you don't have full compatibility with all the bodies and with all the lenses.
Nice. And one thing we talked about earlier is firmware, your camera firmware. Now that we do have the time, before we get into anything, make sure you have the right firmware, right?
Yeah, this doesn't even really matter whether you're doing macro photography, portrait, landscape, especially with the new Z products. As you kind of, we were talking earlier, and you were saying that the evolution of your Z system now with version 3.0 from when it first came out, it's like a brand new camera in terms of the eye autofocus, the face detect. So with the Z products, the Z50, Z6, Z7, those products have grown quite a bit. But even with DSLRs, you always want to make sure you're up to date with your firmware. So you can go check our online database on our website, go into the Nikon Canada site, and then from there you can check the firmware and just make sure that you are fully up to date.
Amazing, amazing. And we have a bunch of people already in the live chat. So guys, if you have questions, let me know. Just drop them in the live chat and I'll make sure to ask Chris the questions. But you have a great workshop planned for us. I have your images ready. Let's get started. So you have the right lens with you. You have the camera. It's updated, right firmware. How do we get started with this?
Well, to be honest, the first thing that you really kind of have to do is just go out and shoot. You can jump right into it and talk and get into lighting and get into focus stacking and kind of get really in depth right off the bat. But a lot of people, they just want to kind of ease themselves into it and just kind of start looking for what makes macro photography fun and enjoyable. And for me, one of the biggest things is when I first start shooting macro, you have to kind of turn on a different part of your brain, because we're so used to, in the regular shooting, okay, landscape, wide angle lens, telephoto, okay, zoom into the bit I want, but you're looking at a very big landscape. With macro, you really want to focus in on the small things, that the details, the texture that normally we don't even look at on our normal day, like just the texture of my desk here. That could be a macro shot if there's some kind of cool wood patterning that you can see that normally you just, okay, I'm going to put my glass here. But you don't really look for the different patterns, the different details. And that's really kind of the first thing to look for, is to look for those details. So whether it's something man-made, or a lot of times it is starting well, it's trying to get nice outside. Trying to, because we keep getting snow for no reason throughout the day.
Hey,
but
I don't know how it's like 5 degrees sunshine yesterday and it's a blizzard as well. I don't know.
I know,
but it happened here in Toronto, so I'm just gonna put that out there.
But so it's getting nicer outside. So one of the really kind of cool things to go in and shoot is the natural world. So whether there's flowers, whether it's bark, whether it's just a tree, these are things that have so much different patterns and details that we normally just gloss over in our everyday lives. So that's kind of the first thing, is to turn your brain off from the way you normally shoot and to really go out there and look for those details. So look for whether it's patterns. You can see a lot of them in leaves. You can see it in trees. Then next, you can really look for colors. Right. Again, one of those things that we never really look at. If a color isn't taking up a vast majority of the frame, we kind of discount it a lot of the time. But with macro, because you can fill the frame with what looks like a tiny little itty bitty flower head, you can make it huge. So looking for those colors, look for those patterns. That's kind of the first thing that I'd really recommend is change your mindset, look small, and look for the things that you normally discount.
Yeah, and I was showing the viewers some of the images, whether it's a leaf or a flower. These are great things to get started with. And one thing I will add is if you're just getting started, picking a pretty subject will make the learning experience a little bit nicer. So if you have a flower there,
Absolutely.
getting in tight, and then working with the rule of thirds, working with the available light, generally you're gonna find a shot that's really easy. I remember when I was getting started, I'm like, let me just go monotone, get the center of a flower, do some macro, and hey, it's gonna look good no matter what. But it allows you kind of that learning experience to be much more pleasing as opposed to intimidating, right?
Exactly.
Once you get those first shots in, I'm just looking at your agenda here. Once you kind of have those first shots, you talk about adding light and manipulating light, and you can get really crazy with this. But how do you get started with controlling and directing light with respect to macro photography?
Well, so if we're going to talk about lighting now kind of adds a whole different aspect to it, where you can either use the natural light. So if you're outside, you can just work with the sunlight. If you're in your house, you can go and work with light streaming in through the windows. But you can also go and add your own light. So whether that means using a speed light, whether that also means using a video light. I personally absolutely love video lights, especially if you're just getting started. Now, video light sounds like some impressive, huge monolith of a thing that you're using. But to be honest, video lights could be something as simple as you just grabbing a flashlight. Yeah. So something that just has a constant stream of light coming out. Because as amazing as speed lights are, and I use them all the time for macro work, if you're just starting out, visualizing how that light is going to fall, especially when it's on such a very small subject matter, it sometimes just takes a little bit of getting used to. So having a flashlight, having a headlamp, having an actual video light really makes a big, big difference. So a couple of the images I sent you. So what you're seeing with the kind of cactusy looking image, those are the exact same subject matter, obviously. But all that was done was the light was moved in terms of its position. So this was a video light that I was just hand holding, and I would just basically started with it off to the right, and you can see the really harsh shadows that you're seing going across the frame to the left. And then as I just kind of shifted the light up towards the top of the subject matter, you start to see that texture really popping, because all those little points on the flower itself, or on the plant itself, really kind of popped out and became like the subject matter of of that image. So just by changing that direction of light can make a huge difference. And it's not as if we're using a speed light and we're doing a portrait where you sometimes need to move the light like 180 degrees to see a big difference. I'm talking like a couple centimeters can make a huge difference in terms of what you're seeing.
And shout out to Emil here that's in the chat saying that got very lucky to capture a bee in flight, but need to plan things out and slow things down. And this is the cool thing with macro photography. It's a great place to learn and to sharpen your skills, even if you don't shoot macro photography, because whether it's these lighting dynamics, when you have a camera like a Z camera where it's mirrorless, what you see is what you get. You can have that constant light, move it around and shape it, and really start to understand how lighting works, where if you bring it closer, you can cut out more of those shadows, make it less harsh. You bring it further from your sharp subject, you can make it more low-key, harder shadows, and really impact that final image with, again, real-world techniques, not any post-processing involved, right?
Yeah, exactly, and that's really, really key. And then you kind of touched on it right there in your point right there, where the first thing you can kind of think about when it comes to lighting is the direction, where it actually is within the frame. But on top of that, you also now have to think about the intensity of light. So how hard do I want that light to be? How intense do I want those shadows to be? So that you can affect by a couple things, either turning your light down or up if you do have that capability, or moving your light source further away from your subject or getting it closer. So I think the next two images, I sent you the point. You're seeing kind of the point of the plant there, and one of them is very, very bright. Yeah. And that was obviously with the light being shone directly at it. But as all I really had to do to decrease the amount of light was actually just to feather the actual light source away. So I didn't actually bring it further away. I didn't decrease the power. I just feathered it directly off, so that you kind of have this more isolated subject, where I wanted that point of the leaf two really stand out to be the subject matter. I didn't care about the background or anything else.
And when you say feather, basically you're tilting it away so that it's not
Yes.
directly on. It's the edge of that light that's hitting your subject, right?
Exactly, exactly.
Amazing. And before we continue, we're going to talk a lot about lighting, but I just had someone in the chat, Jason here, if you could only have one macro lens, I love questions like this. If you could only have one macro lens, what would you pick? 105, 60, or 40? This person has a Nikon D750 and they're asking.
Ooh. I would, so I love the 40. The one downside of it is, as I kind of talked about before with the working distance, it is a little smaller of a working distance. So if you are squeamish and you do start shooting things like bugs, it is going to be a little bit close for your comfort levels, probably. The 60 is spectacular if you're reproducing anything flat. So it has a very flat field correction built into it. So if you're doing stamps, if you're reproducing photographs, it's absolutely spectacular for that. But me personally, I'd probably go with the 105. A, it has the longest working distance. And B, it has the most versatility because it's not like, well, it is, in my opinion, one of our best macro lenses that we have, but it's not just a macro lens because you have a 105 millimeter focal length. So that's a really nice little portrait focal length. And you can shoot at f2.8, so it's a faster aperture as well. So when you put those two together, a lot of wedding or event shooters actually use the 105 not just for the detail shots, but they also turn around and they'll snap some actual portraits with it as well. So the cost of it is obviously more than the other two, but the fact that it's not just more of a one-trick pony, just a macro lens, you get way more bang for your buck. So for me, I'll say the 105 is probably my favorite.
Awesome. Awesome. Thank you guys. And keep the questions coming. I want to go back to lighting because I think that's probably the most fascinating part, me personally speaking. So I want to show people the image here because they saw the earlier image. Here is the image where you feather the light, you move it off of your subject so it's not as direct. And now moving into backlighting. And really, when I saw this picture, I got excited because it's one of those things that people might see. They might see it as a wallpaper and they wonder, hey, how can I capture something like this? So can you walk us through backlighting?
Yeah, honestly, backlighting, you'll start off doing the other ones, kind of play with it. You'll feather the light, you'll turn up the intensity, you'll see what the shadows look like, and then you'll see backlighting and you'll just go, okay, for certain subject matter, this is the only way I am going to shoot it. So this is just, to be honest, the simplest setup you could possibly find. The shot of the leaf here, it's actually just outside in my garden. The sun was coming down. It was it was probably about 6:30, so the sun was kind of 2/3 of the way down, and it was just hitting these leaves in this really nice pattern. I just literally lifted the leaf up just a little bit so it was nice and perpendicular to the way I was shooting, and it got this amazing backlight from that sun, having those really, really cool patterns. And if you look in the top right-hand corner, you'll actually see a tiny little bug up there, the silhouette of a little bug. I didn't even notice that when I was shooting it. I'd love to say that I had planned it, that I knew it was there, that I perfectly put it up in the top right-hand corner to draw it. I didn't even see it. Didn't even see it till I was editing the photo. Wow. So that's kind of the easiest way to get into backlighting, is to do it with subject matter that obviously has some sort of a see-throughness where you're going to be able to get the light passing through. And if you do have that, either early in the morning or late at night when the sun is at its not at its highest, that's really the best time to work on some backlighting. But you can also go and do it yourself. So you can go and get your flash, you can go and get your video lights, your headlamps, your flashlights, and just recreate this by yourself as well, whether it's outside or even inside as well.
Right, right. I want to talk about, you mentioned it before, speed lights versus constant lights, right? Why would someone opt to use a speed light for macro photography?
To be honest, one of the biggest reasons people are going to use it is because they have it. They're comfortable with the way to trigger it, and you're able to either put gels on it so you can change the color of the light very well. Some of our flashes on the higher end come with a couple different color gels. You can go and buy a whole wide range of gels if you wanted to. but it has a huge amount of capability of dialing down the power way, way, way down if you're going to be doing it manually, or you can go and have it be 1-to-1 and full power. Or if you don't want to be shooting manual, you can go and set the camera to TTL, so that the camera and the flash TTL is through the lens metering, which means that the camera and the lens talk to each other. They figure out the perfect exposure and kind of do it all. So in terms of ease of use and something that people are already comfortable with, that's probably why I'd say speed lights are a really, really cool way of shooting macro.
Yeah, and just to jump in there, one person talking about, are you hand holding the light? You can hand hold the light sources, but obviously mounting it somewhere and having it somewhere is just going to make it easier for you to compose and focus on the shot. With respect to speed lights, I love controlling the light. I'm a type A personality. So with speed lights, you could turn on the modeling lamp so you can see where the light is going, but you can actually buy different modifiers such as barn doors or grids and really direct the light and get super, super creative. Like you said, with gels especially, bring the power down or really up. You can build some really interesting recipes. So when it comes to constant versus speed lights, it really depends on what you're trying to capture. But if you want more control, if you're going to be taking it a little bit more seriously, maybe you want to make a full series on Instagram, whatever it may be, speed lights are going to give you a little bit of an edge in being able to control that final result.
I totally agree. And the nice thing about with speed lights or strobes, if you're using the speed light, they work really well for macro, but they really come into their own when we start talking about the product photography side of things. Whereas the constant video lights, you can use them for product photography, but it just becomes a little bit more difficult. And kind of like you said, when you want to get more serious, strobes or actual dedicated speed lights are generally the way that we recommend you go.
Exactly. And guys, I will say, if you go to henrys.com between 12 p.m. and 5 p.m. Eastern, we have a live chat Monday to Friday for you guys to ask questions. So if you're watching this stream and you're like, well, what's the exact lens should I get? Or what light should I get? What's the exact product? Go there, go to our live chat. You'll talk to a real Henrys associate, and they'll be able to help you and guide you in the right direction as well. Let's move along. We want to talk about, this is really cool, focus stacking. This is something that, while I understood what the end result was, I wanted to understand the process and what is actually happening here. And I think it's going to be valuable for our viewers. So what the heck is focus stacking?
So focus stacking is the technique where you take very small slivers of a photo let me put it this way. You're taking multiple images, and each image has a different slice of focus that's in focus. So you're using generally slightly shallower depth of field, and you're using it generally for macro. A lot of people do use it for landscape work as well, and that's totally valid. But for this, I'll just kind of focus more on the macro side. So with the macro, I think I provided an image of the purple plant here. So you can see initially the single slice with most of the image that's out of focus. So that's what you would get if you shot, I believe this was shot at f5.6, maybe f4. Okay. So let's say f4, and you can see that when you get close to your subject and you're using a longer focal length, and you're using a relatively wide open aperture, those three things mean your depth of field is going to be really, really shallow. So that's what I would have got if I just took one image. But what I did is I took, I believe for this one, it was over 80 shots. Over 80 shots, all with different pieces of it that are in focus. Wow. I used software afterwards. It stacked them all together. And then the end result is the next image, which is everything from the beginning to the end is completely in focus. So focus stacking is the technique of creating that one image with everything in focus. But generally, until we had this in our cameras, I will fully admit this, I never, ever, ever did focus stacking, because you either needed a really expensive setup, which had some computer control your lens and camera and do it all for you automatically, or you had to manually do it. And
oh, no, sorry, go ahead. No, you go ahead.
I was just going to say, I myself, I am not good enough to manually know that I'm doing it precise enough to get the same movement in between every image, I could never do it. So for me, I just never tried focus stacking.
And this is the thing. This is something that I never played with before. It's not my genre of photography, but looking at it, I'm like, I would love to at least try it. And one of the things that was intimidating was like getting 80 shots and then throwing it into Photoshop and lining them all. It's a lot of time. But so how does the Nikon make this easier? I see that you have a screenshot of a menu here from a Nikon camera. Which cameras can do this, and how is it easier on Nikon?
So we have so basically all of our newer cameras in the last 2 to 3 years. So it's the D780, D850, D6 on the DSLR side.
Right.
And then on the mirrorless side, we're looking at the Z6 and the Z7. So all 5 of those cameras can go and do focus shift shooting. And focus shift shooting, which if you're seeing the menu screenshot right now, that's basically the automation that allows you to create a focus stacked image. So focus shift shooting, as you can see here, you tell the camera how many shots you want it to take. You tell the camera the focus step width, the interval between shots, the first frame exposure. You tell it all these parameters, and then you hit start. Now, when you actually look into these factors a little bit more, it does get a little bit particular depending on whether you're doing landscapes or macro photography work. Basically, the closer you are to your subject, so the more macro that you're shooting, the higher the number of shots you would want to take, because each slice has to be smaller because your depth of field will be smaller.
Right.
And then the focus step width, that's the one that usually messes people up. So focus step width. So in the screenshot, it's set to 5.
Right.
You have a range from 1, which is very small, to 10, which is very large. And basically that's telling the camera how small of a step should the focus be changed in between shots. So if you're doing macro, you want a very, very, very small change in between the actual shots that you're taking. Whereas if you're doing landscape work, you don't need huge overlap between all your images. You don't need 100 shots for a landscape focus stack. You may only need 6 or 7. So similar to the number of shots, where the closer you are, the more shots you take, for focus step width, the closer you are, the lower that number should be. So I'd say probably if you're doing true macro photography work, such as this purple, the purple example we showed earlier, I'd say probably be at 2 or 3. And then if you're doing landscape work, you can be in the 6, 7, 8, 9 range, depending on how close you're starting and how far you're going to.
Amazing. And before we move on, I have a couple of questions here. So for focus stacking, it would require, for the most part, consistent lighting. So it might not work outdoors if the lighting is constantly changing, right?
Yeah. So if you're doing it outside, the biggest thing you're going to want to be worried about is actually wind.
True.
Even if you're doing so if you set the interval timer to 0 and you're going to do, let's say, 20 shots, your whole sequence will probably be done in a couple seconds. So it's going to be relatively short time period. So as long as you don't have clouds going over top very, very quickly, the lighting itself should be fine. It's actually the wind that you really want to worry about, because you have to make sure that everything is perfectly stable. So this means you absolutely need a tripod. Somebody asked about whether you want to handhold the lights earlier. You can totally handhold lights, but in terms of focus shift shooting, you absolutely want to be shooting on a tripod, being as stable as possible, not only you, but also your subject matter as well.
I have a question here from Angelo. Can you explain 1 to 2 macro older lenses? I'm not entirely sure what the question is, but they're asking about 1 to 2 macro lenses. Does that ring any bells for you?
It does. It does. So I was talking about 1-to-1 macro lenses, which is true magnification, which means that the object in real life is reproduced the exact same size on the sensor. Well, a 1-to-2 is just a half reproduction. So you have, let's say, that same cord that we talked about earlier that filled the entire sensor. Well, now it's going to be half that size in the reproduced image. So you can have 1-to-1, you can have 1-to-2, you can have 1-to-4. So 1-to-4 is a quarter size image. That's usually about the size of what most of our kit lenses do. So it's not a true macro capability, but it gets you kind of close. So some of our lenses, we do have one, it's a 24 to 85 D lens. A lot of actually police and forensics units use this because it's a 24 to 85, so it's a zoom, so it's really versatile, but it actually has a macro switch. So you actually kick it into macro, and now it's a 1:2 macro lens. So it's really, really versatile. Not as close as what you can get with our true macro lenses,
Right.
but it's really, really versatile in that you can use this lens as a walk-around lens, and then, I want to go and shoot this, flip it into macro mode, and you're good to go. Now, it is an older lens, so it is a D lens, so it's not going to autofocus with either the new Z products or with our 3000 or 5000 series bodies. But for any of the other bodies with an autofocus motor in the body itself, it'll work totally fine.
Right, and listen, if everyone's at home and you want to find out who stole the cookies from the cookie jar, a great lens for that kind of forensic work. And thank you, Chris, and thank you, Angelo, for asking the question, because again, this is why we bring in the experts so we can explain it. Before we move on to the next thing, I want to ask, just with respect to the focus stacking. So if I have this understood correctly, on these newer Nikon cameras, it's going to do all the heavy lifting for you and produce the end result, or is it producing all the files that you then put into software? I just want to clarify that.
Bingo. Yep. So I want to go into talking about that because the software is a big part of it.
Okay.
The camera itself does not go and produce the final image. So it goes and gives you those 20, those 50, those 100 images that you've told it to,
Right.
and then you take all 100 and you would take that into a third-party software such as Photoshop, or my personal favorite is Helicon. Helicon focus software, it is phenomenal. Now, you do have to pay for it. They do have a free trial, which if you want to play with it, it is such a powerful program.
Right.
A couple of our guys that I've kind of got into doing some focus stacking, which I think we'll talk about later, he has fallen in love with Helicon. Photoshop works, it's good,
Right.
but I find that it needs a little bit more hand-holding if you have a difficult subject matter.
Gotcha. But I mean, I was going to say it would take an insane amount of processing power for anyone to do this in camera. But the fact that you can get everything sort of set up so you have all the ingredients to then just throw to your software, I mean, that's a great feature to have. The next shot, and this is where it gets really exciting for me, you're talking about family projects and having a little bit more fun with this. And let me actually throw it up for everyone watching here. We got Legos here, okay? We got a whole scene coming together. So
there's a lot of scenes coming out here. So this is not my shot. This was actually one of our sales reps out west in BC, Jay Goff. We're all obviously self-isolating at home, but I've been on a daily basis giving our sales guys some little challenges, some quizzes, just to kind of keep them on their toes. And one of the things that I kind of started was getting to know your camera. Some of the guys who've been there for years and years know some of this, but some of the new guys may not know everything back to front. So I gave them a focus shift shooting challenge, and Jay took it, and I cannot believe how well he did with this. Not just as a work project that kind of got him to really realize what goes into this whole technique, but he got his kid involved. So he has two boys. One of them, Ethan, he's about 6 or 7, I believe. I'm not sure if Jay's listening and can type that as if I got it wrong. But he got his kid involved. He basically said, okay, we're playing with the Legos all the time. Ethan, why don't you come up with a scenario? Why don't you tell me the scene that you want me to build? So they would actually do it. Jay's made, I believe, over 15 of these now. Wow. And it kind of turned into this daily project where they would sit down the night before and they would kind of storyboard it. They would kind of figure out what they wanted to do. The next day, they would go and shoot it. So Ethan would help Jay kind of create the size. And he was, after like the first 1 or 2, he was the art director now. He was like, no, Daddy, you can't put that there. This has to go here. Snape wouldn't be shooting the Death Eater. He'd be going and shooting at Hermione. So he was getting really, really picky at all this. And it allowed Jay to have this really kind of fun time with his son where they built it during the day. Yeah. He would shoot it, he would edit it at night, and then he would show him the finished product. So it turned from this kind of fun work project to this real kind of family bonding where I'm not sure how many you've shown, but he didn't just...
The next one with the graphics here. They even went through this at the Photoshop. They threw some special effects. This is amazing.
Oh yeah, he didn't. So he started with just the flat image, and then his son basically said, "Well, Dad, this is Harry Potter. Where are the spells? Where's the mist? Where's the atmosphere? There's nothing here. This is just the picture." So then Jay had to go down another rabbit hole of, okay, how do I recreate wands in Photoshop, and then he turned it even further, because if you look at the lamp light coming off of I think that's the caretaker Filch. He created lamp lighting coming off of all the things. But then he started going, okay, well, hold on a second. Now when I'm start dealing with more complex subjects, so he went into his office, he went into like the jungle, and if you really start looking at it and getting really picky, he started looking at crazy things like how does the wands spells that are being put out, as there, let's say there's a blue and a red spell hitting each other.
Right.
Well, what is that going to do to the subject, to the Lego person? What kind of back shine is that going to create?
Right,
so
right,
he went
right,
into
right.
some crazy rabbit holes with this, and it turned into a Photoshop project, a focus shift shooting project, a family bonding. It was really cool, kind of how he ran with it.
Amazing, amazing. And guys, listen, if you want to see a workshop just on this, where we build a scene and shoot it, I mean, listen, let us know. But if you have any questions, also let us know. This is amazing. So shout out to Jay in BC. This is fantastic. This is fantastic. The next thing I want to move on to is product photography, because product photography, there might be some similarities, but it also is a different end result than macro photography a lot of the time. So let's talk about product photography.
Yeah, so just like with macro, you can start off really basic, or you can kind of go a little bit more on the complex side. On the complex side, so the couple martini glasses I think that you can show here, this was actually another one of our sales reps, also at West, middle of the country in Alberta. This was Russ, and him and his daughter actually created this as a family project as well. Wow. So he turned this into let's kind of learn a little bit about photography, how kind of showing her how to set things up, but at the same time, she was his assistant. So she was dropping the fruit and they were kind of working together, because if you've ever tried this yourself, just you dropping it and taking the picture at the right moment can be sometimes tough enough. So just them working together and figuring out when she drops it, when he shoots, all of these things kind of just create more of a family bond. And he went a little bit more on the advanced side. So he was, I believe, using 3 flashes here. He was using basically 2 lights on the side as rim lights, and then he had 1 bouncing up off into the ceiling to create a little bit of a halo on the top of the glass. So he went a little bit more on the advanced side, just because he works for Nikon and he has the flashes there. But he loved this, and they've done it. I believe they were going to redo a second one because she wasn't totally happy with some of the images. So I think she wanted to go and redo it. So they're going to do a round 2. But those kind of 2 fun projects, whether it was the Harry Potter Lego or the martini fruit drop, that for me was just a lot of fun to hear from them what they were able to do with their kids. And just while we're at home, it's not just about your learning. It's also like, if anybody has kids of the age where you have to keep them entertained, you know that it's tough. It's an all-day challenge when you're there with them all the time, and you are still trying to do some work. So it's kind of cool that they were able to take this self-isolation and turn it into a family bonding thing, which gave them knowledge for work, but it also was a lot of fun with their family too.
Yeah, and one of the things when I saw that image, right away I'm looking at, all right, where are the light sources here? Because he's definitely using speed lights to stop the action. And I'm looking at the halos, I'm like, I see the 2 on the side, but having 1 up top, really kind of brings out that picture, and I can see how that brings that amazing end result. But it doesn't have to be that hard, and I think the next sort of images highlight that, right? Where you can kind of get up and running without a lot of, fancy equipment or 3 or 4 speed lights, right?
Yeah, so you don't have to have any speed lights, to be honest with you. It helps to have it, especially if you, like you said earlier, you do want to control that light. If you want to make sure that you're able to mold it exactly the way you want it, then you're going to want speed lights. But if you just want to kind of get started, this was I just did a quick setup last week as you and I were talking, and I usually use speed lights, but because I'm at home, well, what happens if I don't have them? Or what happens if I have a beautiful bright window that is streaming light through the middle of the day? Well, what can I do? Well, I can use that light. So just using the light streaming in through the window and that bounce card, I have 3 different examples. I have the first image, which obviously has a much heavier shadow along the north side of the subject there,
right?
And you can see the very heavy shadow. That was just pure sunlight hitting the hitting the knife from the bottom and then creating that shadows.
Right.
The second image is using that bounce fill card, that white fill card, just ever so slightly. I'm just kind of getting rid of a little bit of it, but I was a little bit backed off. And then the last image was the exact same setup, but me just getting that fill card really close and tight in so that I could basically try and get rid of as much of that shadow as possible.
Amazing, amazing. And again, as people get more and more fluent with lighting, getting a piece of foam core or maybe even white Bristol board, whatever it may be, you can even find things around the house, right? You might even be able to find some bed sheets that you can throw up that can act as diffusion or bounce, depending on how you're going to be using them. And it just allows you to get a result like this that's a bit more cleaner than the first image I was showing, which is, again, a good image, but it's these small, small things. And I think you'll agree, Chris, it's those small, small attention to detail things that really bring out that image. And again, allow you to get a great image out of camera. Fantastic, fantastic.
Yep. Yeah, that's the biggest thing. So like even like a piece of white paper, you don't need anything crazy. If you go get some white paper and you either just hold it yourself or have somebody else hold it, you can go and use that. But it is a lot on the detail. And even with this knife shot here, I personally wasn't a fan of the shadow being so harsh along the top of the knife. I kind of wanted it more side. But one of those details that I was really cognizant of is the way the light was streaming in. Do you see the knife edge, the very kind of like little highlight of silver you get? Well, I was only able to achieve that really kind of little glimmer of the edge knife by having the knife in one particular location. If I had it anything other than moved this way in relation to where the sun was coming, that knife edge just disappeared and the whole image just kind of went a little flat because that little edge just kind of gave it a little bit more of a pop that you normally wouldn't want. So you really have to slow down when you're doing product photography because the smallest things can make a really, really big impact on your final image.
Amazing. And before we move on, there is a question here. Is Emil's asking, what are your thoughts on ring lights versus speed lights?
If he's talking about he's probably asking about for macro. I have no issue with using ring lights. The only thing is, depending on your subject matter, it can get a little bit, I'll say depending on the subject matter and where you want the shadows to come from, the ring lights sometimes limit you in terms of what you're able to do. By getting your flash, just like when we shoot with, let's say, portraiture, because the same question could be asked for portraiture. What about ring lights on a camera for portraits versus getting your flash off camera? I would say usually I prefer my light source to be off axis of where I'm actually shooting. It gives a little bit more of a better overall feel. Whether it's macro or portraiture. Ring lights definitely do work though, and certain subjects work really well with it. But I would say, depending on your subject matter and what your end result is kind of in your head, I would usually say getting the flash off camera, but it's a very personal choice.
Yeah, and one thing I'll just jump in and say is if you want to make this decision a little bit easier, especially as you're kind of weighing out what product to get and invest in, find images that you like, that you want to recreate and create a little bit of a mood board for yourself. And from there, try to work backwards and think what kind of light would be used. And I have to agree with you, the speed light versus ring light, the speed light just gives you a little bit more versatility, a little bit more latitude, more control in my opinion. The ring light is very good at very specific things. And it might be the type of macro photography you want to do, but again, it really depends on what your end result is going to be. So make a decision based on that.
Yep.
Amazing,
yep,
guys.
Totally agree.
And keep the questions coming. I'm going to move on. I got to show another image. We got a beautiful wine bottle here. I don't have the year in front of me. I don't know when this was made, but a beautiful shot here. Let's talk about this kind of product photography, the type of stuff you'd see on a website, for example.
Yeah, so this is now a little bit more on the advanced side. So for this type of stuff, I would not only recommend using either strobes or dedicated speed lights, but now you're also talking about what you had kind of brought up earlier, which is diffusers. So different types of diffusers, whether they're barn doors, whether they're strip boxes. You're going to want to now really be able to control the light. So I have a sequence of 5 images that I gave you, Gadgen, and what I think as we kind of go through them, I'll kind of walk through and tell you the thought process between all of them. So the first image, you can actually see the small softbox reflections in the sides of the bottle, but they're not actually equal. So I'll get to that in a second. But you really want to be able to showcase the product with the light. So by using very thinner strip boxes, you're not getting very thick images. So thick light reflections off of your bottle. So when you have a very reflective surface, such as a wine bottle, you do want to show it off, but you want to do it in a very particular manner. So in this case, strip boxes were used. It wasn't just a big soft box. It was a strip of light. So you're only having a very small, thin piece of light actually hitting the subject. And in this case, you're seeing those very thin reflections along the side, giving that beautiful curvature of the body, but not really taking away from it and taking up too much of the real estate. So you can see that there are two of them. There's one on the left, one on the right, illuminating the two sides of the bottle. But the downside to having those two on the far right and left is you miss out a little bit on the label. So the next image is purely using a third light as basically a label light is kind of what I'll call it. And all that's doing, its entire purpose in life is just to fill in your label so that you're having a much more easier flow as you look at that image. From left to right, that wine bottle label is nice, evenly lit. Now, the good thing about that image is now the bottle is decently lit, but what about the background? The edges of that bottle kind of fall away when you look at that background. So there's a number of different ways to go in and light the background. You can go and use a snoot. You can go and use barn doors. You can go and just, if you're using a speed light, you can just vary the zoom of the actual head. So if you're doing that, you can change how wide or how narrow of a field of beam the speed light's actually putting out. And as you can see in that third image, it's just creating a little bit of separation between the background and the subject matter.
Right. Amazing.
Now the next image is the final image. So this is with 1, 2, 3. So this is 4 lights in total using what would we use? Soft boxes on the left and the right being the strips, and then just bare flashes on the bottle, and then the bare flash with a relatively tight pattern going into the background. So that's the end result. But what I want you to do now, if you could, show that 5th image. It looks very similar, but a lot of people don't realize that 4th image we showed is not final out of the camera, because there is usually a decent amount of Photoshop work that actually needs to go into a lot of product photography. If you've kind of mentioned a few times today, you want to get as much out of the camera as you possibly can, and that is fully right. But you can't do everything out of the camera perfectly. There's going to be some reflections. There's going to be some maybe shadows that pop up. So in this case, you'll see the small little point light source on the very top of the head of the bottle, and then you'll see a point light source in the middle along with some very light reflections. So what a lot of people don't realize is that with product photography, there's a lot of post-processing that usually goes into it. Not everybody. Some people are going to spend days and days and days going and setting up their whole setup with whiteboards and blackboards and taking away light and dialing it all in, and you can do that. But even then, you usually need a little bit of post-processing to just give that final image the little kind of sparkle it needs.
Amazing, right? And it's one of these things where, cut some time out in your day. Enjoy the process of it. Take your time doing it. Maybe light some candles, throw on some jazz music, whatever it may be. But it is a process. But one of the things you immediately recognize as you play with macro and product photography, it's a great way to learn lighting. And right away, when I looked at your image, having done this for a little while with portraits and that, in that realm, right away I say, okay, he's starting with the 2 fill lights and building some character there. Then he's throwing this paramount light in front that's gonna, light the subject really nicely, and then a backlight for that separation. A lot of these fundamentals with respect to product photography can carry over to portrait, fashion, whatever it may be. So a great time, if you're at home self-isolating as you should be, a great time to really practice these fundamental skills that you can carry on to whatever genre you might be shooting.
Absolutely. That for me is kind of what you said is so key. There are so many crossovers in the photography world, and lighting. It doesn't matter what type of lighting you're doing, whether it is for macro, whether it is for portraits. They cross over so much. So if you're comfortable shooting portraiture, and you know that, okay, I'm going to have my main light, I'm going to have my fill light, I'll have my rim light here. Well, a lot of the principles completely carry over to macro. It's just now on a smaller scale. So knowing one helps you learn other techniques, and it becomes really easy. The one thing I will say about when you're shooting with speed lights, doing product photography, is I would highly recommend to shoot manual flash. We do obviously have TTL, but as you are adding in your lights, by adding in another light, that could affect the TTL reading from the first light that you already had perfectly set up. So the nice thing about when you're doing your macro or product setups is you usually have a little bit more time. You're not kind of running and gunning and worried that the model's thinking that you're an idiot because you're not getting it done in one shot. So you have a little bit more time. I would really try to learn manual flash for doing inside product photography, because that control can mean all the difference between nailing the shot in 15, 20 minutes, or it taking you an hour because your TTL levels of all your flashes kind of keep ramping up and down and you don't know how to control them. So do it kind of in a nice stepwise fashion and do it all in manual.
Amazing. And I'll jump in here before I jump in. That kind of answers a question from Emil again, is the individual light intensity will need to be established for this, a lot of trial and error. So again, TTL through the lens metering, the camera decides how to expose those flash. When you're doing stuff like this, again, you want as much control as possible. It might seem intimidating. It's not. It's really just gauging the power. And again, trial and error. As you add one light, check out the power, see what the shot looks like. And as you move into more advanced, I guess, workflows, say you want to, make them more replicable, where the recipes, you can save the recipes or get faster. This is where you might consider a light meter, an actual tool that's dedicated to metering light, where you can actually, say, what, I want to have the aperture at 5.6 or 8 or 11, and then set up the lights based on that. Again, it makes the process a little bit easier, allows you to replicate the results. I'm throwing a bunch of things out there. Again, if you have questions with respect to specific products, whether it's flashes, speed lights, light meters, where to get started, again, you can go to henrys.com, use our live chat Monday to Friday between 12 and 5 p.m. Eastern. You can talk to our associates and ask them these questions. Which one should I get? There's a bunch of options there. You don't need the most expensive one. It's really coming back to what you're going to be doing and what you're going to be shooting. I'm going to do one final call out. If you guys have any questions, there's a bunch of you watching. If you have any last minute questions, just throw them in the chat and I'll throw them to Chris. But Chris, thank you so much for your time. One of the things is that you guys at Nikon have, really taken this as an opportunity to teach, to educate, and there's a bunch of resources. So for the workshops that you're doing and Nikon is putting together, where can people find this stuff that you guys are doing?
So we've kind of like you, we're really trying to help people when they're at home to either brush up on some of their photography that they've forgotten or learn about new techniques. So we've really taken it so that basically 2 to 3 times a week on our Facebook, and then we put them up on YouTube afterwards. So it's either our Nikon Canada YouTube page, you'll find a lot of the videos, but also we're streaming them. We have, I believe, one going out today. I'd have to check. But yeah, so we're streaming previously filmed footage that we have. So sometimes we do our free seminars at our Nikon head office. Right. And with those seminars, we actually did one, it was about 1.5 years ago, and then we just restreamed it last week on macro and focus shift shooting. So when you and I guys were talking about this and you mentioned macro, I was like, hey, wait a second. I think that was on the day that we were streaming it on our Nikon Canada Facebook site. I was like, are you following us that well? I'm like, wow, that's impressive. Yeah, of course I can talk about this because I've done the presentation years ago. But so we're doing a lot of educational stuff on our streaming Facebook Nikon Canada site. Right. But I'm also doing personally our Nikon TV. So Nikon TV is just little episodes where we try and just have basically what you're doing here, a very intimate kind of casual conversation where we either have a guest on or I just talk about what's new. I have a whole getting to know your camera feature. So I talk about maybe autofocus fine tuning, why you need to do it, when you have to do it. So we have those basically going out every 2 weeks. So I'm going to have one this Friday. I just did one 2 Fridays ago. ago. So if people want to go check those out, they absolutely can. They're kind of fun. You'll see my kitchen. I'm not in the office like I am right now. I'm set up in my
Nice.
kitchen downstairs. So they're just a fun way to kind of help people stay inspired, stay shooting during this time, and just to learn something new.
Amazing, amazing. Thank you so much, Chris. You are a wealth of information. And listen, I've learned a bunch already, so we're going to definitely do this again soon. And if you guys have suggestions on what we should cover, what we should talk about, just send us a direct message on Instagram or Facebook or Twitter and let us know, and we'll do our best to put it together. Chris, thank you again for your time. And where can
My
people
pleasure.
follow Nikon on social media? What's the handle officially for them?
Ooh, put me on the spot here. Our Instagram is Nikon Canada. And then our Facebook is our Nikon. You'll see the little blue check approved Nikon.
Nice.
If you are in Canada, it'll automatically route you to the Nikon Canada page.
Beautiful. That was a rhetorical question, folks, because I have it in his lower third. I just wanted to get him to say it. Thank you so much for watching, guys, and we'll see you again soon.